Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Paul Sowerbutts. I'm a solicitor at Landlord Action.
And I'm Sonia. I'm a barrister at Five Paper.
This is a podcast on pets in rented accommodation, introduced by the Renters' Rights Act, coming into force on the 1st of May next year, 2026.
So, Paul, let's get right into it. There are two parts to this. Firstly, can you refuse to rent to someone who has pets? And secondly, if you have a tenant already and they request a pet, do you have to grant consent to allow them to have a pet at the property? I think, for the purposes of this discussion at the moment, let's presume that it is a flat and that the lessor has already given permission for pets.
No, most leases will allow pets, which may be conditional on getting consent or limiting to the pet or maybe two pets.
Yeah. So dealing with the first point, blanket ban is likely to be discriminatory.
Yeah, because of service dogs, for example, or emotional support.
Yeah, it's likely to be indirectly discriminatory under the Equality Act 2010, as disability is a protected characteristic, and someone who requires a service dog or emotional support, a dog for emotional support, is likely to be suffering from a disability.
Yeah, that's already the case. So we know that landlords cannot refuse to show a property to all potential tenants just because they have a pet. They have to consider a request. Let's not go into detail at the moment as to when it can be refused or granted, because there is a crossover if a tenant asks to have a pet at the property.
Yeah. So some existing tenancy agreements have a blanket ban for pets, but the Consumer Rights Act 2015 prohibits unfair terms in a contract. So I think it's very likely that a blanket ban on keeping pets in a tenancy agreement might be struck out if it's challenged by the courts.
Yeah, that's in any case. But obviously now we have got the Renters' Rights Act coming into force next year, and there are now specific clauses relating to pets in rental property.
Yes, so it's Section 12 of the Renters' Rights Act, which inserts a new Section 16A into the Housing Act 1988, which gives tenants the right to request a pet. And of course, the key point here, such request cannot be unreasonably refused. But before we move on, let's just say at the outset that you cannot charge a greater deposit or require the tenant to have the flat professionally cleaned. Because if you do so, it's likely that requiring a greater fee is unlikely to be in breach of the Tenants Fees Act 2019, and you cannot require them to have it professionally cleaned, but you can require them to have them clean it to a professional standard, right, because that means they can clean it.
Right, okay. So, so maybe a little bit of history there. Under the passage of the Renters' Rights Act through Parliament, it was original provision that they could require a tenant to have a pet damage insurance, but that was removed by the Lords at that stage, and they inserted it to allow landlords to charge a pet deposit. However, that then was subsequently removed in the Commons. So what can landlords do, Sonia?
Well, I suppose a landlord could consider that they could charge a higher rent at the start of the tenancy. But first of all, we know it can't be a blanket charge just because they have a pet, because Tenants Fees Act 2019. But if it was a higher rent for for anyone, it could be that particular rent could then be challenged, because it's likely to be, it may take the rent to above market rent.
Yeah, but I suppose we are a nation of animal lovers, so it's going to be a reality that you'll have to consider granting tenancy to a pet owner or allowing a tenant to have a pet. So that is going to affect the market price, I suppose, in the end.
Yeah, but the key to it is what is unreasonably refused. And I think that before you can consider consent or refusal, there are a number of questions that need to be asked of the tenant or potential tenant.
And if the tenant believes that their request has been unfairly denied, they can then escalate that to a complaint to the Ombudsman, the private rented sector Ombudsman.
Yeah.
Okay, so coming back to the questions, at Landlord Action, we can provide assistance in drafting such questions give guidance as to when the court may state that the consent could be refused. And if consent is granted, we can consider what amendments to the tenancy agreement would be required.
I mean, I think there are clear reasons when I think that the court will find that consent has been unreasonably refused. You can't simply refuse consent because you consider that all the pets will damage the property. Because the court will quite simply say, well, you can charge the tenant for any damage caused by the pet. And of course, you will then need a provision in the tenancy agreement to say that you could charge them.
So at Landlord Action, we can review tenancy agreements and consider whether there is adequate protection for you as a landlord to recover the costs of any damage. And if there isn't, any consent can be conditional upon agreeing to variations in the tenancy agreement.
Yeah. I mean, I think there could be other reasons where a landlord could, for instance, refuse. For instance, if there is someone in the building very close by to the property who has a pet allergy, or, for instance, that they have a phobia, a medically recognised phobia, I stress though, then I think you could refuse consent for a pet. But even if, and I think you could also consider that the flat is small. So you may say, well, the flat's too small, so it's clearly not reasonable to have a pet there. But I think you have to be very careful there. You may have to consider whether there's a park close by, if it's a dog. So even if the flat is small, the dog could still be exercised adequately. Or, for instance, you may want to consider, well, is the owner going to be at work all day? So is there a potential issue about the welfare of the animal?
Yeah, so, I mean, tenants are out all day, often at work, as you say. So who's looking after the pet? I mean, dogs, as I understand it, can be crated.
Yeah, they can be, but the problem is that the RSPCA states that crating should be for no more than a few hours. And so if a dog is left on its own, you may then have an issue of the dog barking because it's alone, and then it's causing a nuisance to all the other people in the building.
So, whatever the situation is, we think it is legitimate to ask all the questions relating to welfare, care provisions to stop the pet escaping, how it needs to be supervised, and have conditions in the tenancy agreement relating to vaccinations, tick and lice treatments, welfare and care, including complying with legal obligations such as a microchip.
Yeah, I mean, after all, if the pet isn't happy, it may very well cause a nuisance. I think, though, also there may be some circumstances where you may be able to require a report, for instance, from a dog behaviourist, or if it's an exotic animal. It may be that you require that you don't know what certificates are required, so you may require an expert to say that all the relevant certifications have been complied with. So I think there's highly likely, though, I think from whatever we've said, that there's likely to be require amendments to the tenancy agreement. And it may be that you would require a clause in there, for instance, that if the pet causes a nuisance, that the consent is deemed withdrawn and the pet must be removed, for instance, within 14 days. Right.
Okay. Well, yes, I suppose putting exotic pets to one side, it's clear that dogs are going to be the more problematic because of their barking. Although I'm sure some dog lovers amongst us wouldn't agree with that.
Well, I think, you'll find, though, Paul, that cockerels could also be a problem in an urban area. But I agree, Paul. I think it's the dogs that are going to be the potential for most of the problems.
Yeah, so the key will be seeking enough information to consider whether the pet is suitable for the property, and if consent is given, making it conditional on agreement to such variations of the tenancy agreement.
And again, you have to consider whether the refusal will be seen to be unreasonable if it's challenged in the courts, and what to do if it is challenged.
Okay, so how do we think it will be challenged?
Well, I think there'll be potentially two ways that will be challenged. Firstly, the tenant themselves could seek a declaration from the court that the landlord has unreasonably refused the consent because it's going to be a term of the tenancy agreement that they are allowed pets. And then they could seek a declaration and damages. And the other way, though, I think, is if the landlord decides to seek, for instance, possession or even an injunction requiring the removal of the animal. At that point, I think that the tenant may very well say, well, you've unreasonably refused consent. And of course, the court will then have to consider in both of those occasions whether consent was reasonably or unreasonably refused.
Right, so it's important that any decision made by the landlord, whether pets are allowed in the property, must be fully informed and considered.
And that there are adequate provisions contained in the tenancy agreement to give protection to the landlord if the pet causes a nuisance or, for instance, any damage to the property.
Okay, so here's some pointers as to handling pet permission requests, a sort of step-by-step process, if you will. So once you receive an application for renting with pets, make sure that you follow this structured approach and respond to requests in a timely and well-documented manner. Firstly, the tenant must submit a formal written request. It must be in writing, detailing the specific pet they wish to keep. You don't need to grant permission for any animal.
No, but you do need to respond within 28 days.
Right, so in most cases, landlords must respond to the pet request in writing themselves, writing within 28 days. This response should either approve or deny the request.
And I think if you require any additional information, which we think you will do, such as welfare and care needs, or any other legal issues that you need to know about, you can request this information during that same period.
Right, so sort of legal, like we mentioned, the microchipping and whatever, yeah.
The microchipping, what breed it is, what vaccinations they have. Just, there's going to be a wide range of information that you're going to require before you can consent.
Yes.
That's going to actually determine whether you can grant consent
Absolutely.
or not.
Dependent not upon the pet, dependent upon the property. Okay, so if the tenant provides additional information, you can then extend the decision deadline by, let's say, 7 days. But if the tenant fails to provide that request, respond to that request for more information, then as a landlord, you don't need to do anything else.
But going back to the point that I mentioned earlier about the lease, the superior lease, you must check if there is a superior lease within that 28-day period. You must consider whether you need to ask for consent from the superior landlord, and if you do, you must make that request at that time. But you don't need to respond to the tenant until 7 days have passed after you've had a response from the superior landlord.
Okay, so tenants must seek permission for any pet staying at the property regardless of ownership. This is an important point as well. So even if a pet belongs to a friend or a family member, permission is still required if it consistently lives in the rental unit. Sorry, go on.
I mean, I remember recently I was in court. And there was it was a landlord and a tenant, both discussing matters. And it was clear that the landlord was seeking possession and the tenant was saying, well, actually, it's not my pet. It's my friend's pet. I'm just dog sitting. But it makes no difference.
Yeah, without permission, the tenant would be in breach of the tenancy agreement. Yeah. Okay, so we'll hope you found that useful. Sonia and I are available to assist in these sort of matters when, I think, a tenant seeks permission for a pet.
So, goodbye.
Goodbye.